So today we're going to replace the intake manifold on a 2009 Vespa S or LX. The scooter is 15 years old now that it's a 2009 and we're in 2024. And I can almost guarantee any of these rubber manifolds, after about 15 years, they're going to start developing cracks. And the worst case is they get a crack all the way through and you have an air leak. And I'll show you how to diagnose that before we even start the job. You might be chasing your tail, trying to get a scooter to idle right, and it stalls out. You know, it's got a perfectly good brand new carburetor, still stalls out. It's probably your intake manifold. So before you start the job, of course, it's pretty important you have the parts. The OEM parts are pretty affordable. Part number for the manifold is 849465. And this fits for the North American model 150 Vespas and the Piaggio Fly from 2001 all the way up to 2009. Once they were fuel injected, it was a different manifold, and those could fail as well. Same with 50 cc's, the GT200, GTS, they all have a combination of a metal and a rubber manifold, and they do eventually deteriorate just because they're rubber. Different part numbers though. So that one's specific for this scooter if you got an LX 150, S150. Pretty important, you need the gasket as well. 871167. Order both of those as a pair. If you find them on the Scooter West web store, you could see them as associated parts. Pretty important that you just have a easy to use hose clamp for the one vacuum hose to the evap canister, and this is HCL4 Mini. And I'll show you some of the tools needed. Pretty simple basic set of tools. 8mm socket on a 1/4 inch ratchet. Diagonal pliers are pretty helpful, and a flat blade screwdriver. And the last thing that could also help you out with this job is having grease, specifically the Maxima waterproof grease, nice and thick. Only reason we're going to use it is there's an issue that a lot of people run into with this gasket, and I'll show you when we get to it. And this can come in handy not only for cleaning the parts inside a carburetor, but diagnosing a vacuum leak on one of these older carbureted scooters. I'll show you how to do that. All right, so intake manifold, the way you access many of the components on a Vespa are just pull the pet carrier, the underseat bucket, so that pulls right out once you lift up the seat. A little bit dirty under there. Probably a good idea that you pressure wash the scooter. You don't really want dirt going into the intake of the engine. So there's a easy telltale that this manifold's kind of coming to age. There's a crack right here. And sometimes they crack underneath, and those are much harder to see, but I'll show you how to find an air leak on it. You hear that idle, or it stalls out. If you hear any change in idle, or it stalls out, when you douse the whole intake manifold with some sort of flammable spray, such as brake cleaner or card spray, then you know you definitely have an air leak. If it makes no change at all, you likely don't have an air leak, you have other issues. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and do the job. Sometimes there's some wiring in the way, you kind of just tuck that out of the way. I'll take more of that cleaner, kind of just clean around there. It's not gonna really hurt anything that some of the dirt goes other places. You have two hoses going into that brass spigot. The small one either goes to a vacuum fuel tap in conjunction to an air injection valve that's a part of the emissions control system. I just leave that stuff in place. It doesn't really have any issues other than sometimes you'll hear a little pop from the exhaust. It helps it run a little cleaner. So typically this one, it has like a little clip here, and you can just rock this right off. It may be also a perfect time to replace a hose. If you're not going to replace a hose, one other little tip is sometimes take that existing wire hose clamp, and you see how the end of the hose is a little bit chewed up? Go ahead and just cut that off and you have a new piece. But oftentimes these hoses are kind of getting to the end of their life. You may want to just replace that hose as well. This hose is to the evaporative emissions system. It's got a little check valve or a little limiter valve right there, and essentially captures the vapors from the fuel tank. And when the engine's running, it will burn those off. Typically, they never have any issues unless you're overfilling the tank constantly. So again, I would probably leave that in place because it keeps your garage from smelling like a gas fume factory. And it's got the original clamp from the factory when they assembled this. One of the easiest ways to remove these clamps when there's one-time use is just cut it with a pretty large diagonal pliers. It's also possible to kind of take them apart, and you can kind of push the clamp out of the way. The hose has been on there for 15 years, so it's a little on the tight side. Again, as these hoses get older and harder, sometimes it's time to replace these as well, and you could probably do the same. Cut that and have a nice new end to go onto the intake manifold. It's not a bad idea, because it's oftentimes the ends of the hoses fail before anything else. I didn't do a very good job cutting that, but I'll do a little bit better job with a sharp knife. So the next step would be loosen the carburetor from the intake manifold. And as these get older, they get really hard, hence why they crack, but it also means the carburetor is pretty difficult. So it's got an equivalent of a large hose clamp on there. You can see other little cracks forming, different spots. Sometimes you can push a screwdriver all the way through the various cracks, like that. It's going all the way through, and that's causing an air leak, and it's not metering the fuel correctly, and will cause for poor idle no matter how you adjust the carburetor. And I'm actually using that flat blade screwdriver to kind of lever the carburetor away from the intake manifold, especially since it's hard. And you can kind of just set that aside for right now. And at this point, 8mm socket, break them both free. I like this little tray right here. I usually use that to store hardware or trash until I'm done with the job. And go ahead and lift the manifold out of the way very carefully. You're wondering, where's that gasket? Well, it's probably stuck to the bottom of this. I mean, probably don't really want to reuse that. You do want to reuse this clamp. That's no problem, but you can see there's cracks all over the place developing on this intake manifold. It's definitely beyond its lifespan right there. Eventually, sometimes it'll break all the way through, and you'll have such a massive air leak you can't even start the scooter. So you have this gasket here. So you think you can probably just set it there? Well, guess what? The gasket disappears underneath the fan and cylinder covers, and that's not a good thing, because believe it or not, I've had customers tow a scooter in because they could never get the scooter running right after they replace the intake manifold. And we pull their replaced intake manifold, and we'll find the gasket like that, like halfway down, so there's a massive air leak under there. So the best way to hold this in place is with some of that Maxima grease. It's not going to hurt the gasket. You only need a little bit, just a couple little dabs. And the only reason the grease is used is just to hold the gasket in place. So oftentimes, as I install the manifold, I'll pay attention to make sure that I don't move that gasket around. It's kind of got like a little seal all the way around. You can see I move the gasket a little bit, kind of hold it in place. And we'll get the screws started by hand. Pretty important, you're not going to be able to just go to town with your ratchet here usually. So get both those screws started. Go and spin them both all the way on. And if you want to torque this with a torque wrench, about 7.5 foot-pounds. But if you're using a 1/4 inch drive like this, just make sure it's pretty even. Here we go between the two here. And just a little bit with your wrist, and that's all it needs. So take that existing hose clamp. We do sell that as a spare part if you lose it or if it's in bad condition. And at this point, get behind the carburetor. And it's very important to push the carburetor all the way in. See that little tooth right there? that engages with that little rubber pair of prongs right there. And make sure it's also engaged in the bottom. Sometimes it is possible to have the carburetor kind of halfway into the manifold, and you'll end up with an air leak or running issues as well, the brand new one. Let's go ahead and tighten the hose clamp here. And it's pretty important to have this adjuster on this side. If you have it on this side, this is your throttle pulley, and it could bind up with that throttle pulley. I don't really want to have that issue. But you can see I have it on the left side of the scooter if you're sitting on it. So, see, intake manifold kind of isolates vibration from the carburetor, you know, along with keep the fuel and gases where they need to go. So, all right, so now that the carburetor is in place, we'll go ahead and put the little hose clamp, the HCL4 Mini, and go ahead and push the hose all the way on, just like that. It's not too critical what position this is, as long as it's past where the barb is. So kind of scooch it down there. Go ahead and tighten the hose clamp. You know, nice and easy to use. Worm gear clamp, so that's on there nice and tight. Then this other hose for the air injection or the fuel tap just slides right on. And oftentimes the original clip, you could just use your fingers to kind of clamp that right in place there. So pretty important to have these wires, make sure they're not in the way of the throttle pulley. There is a clip on the fan cover. You could route these wires underneath the carburetor. That's how they did it on the older ones. The later years, they started just zip tying it to the this clamp right here, to that hose. And pretty much that's how you replace the intake manifold on pretty much any of the modern Vespas, whether 4-stroke, 2-stroke, 50cc, 250, 300. Very commonplace to have a rubber and metal manifold like that. Go ahead and start it back. It's all idling good. And I'll let the scooter warm all the way up, and I'll probably make an adjustment to the idle speed and possibly the mixer screw, which is on the side of the carburetor. Now there's no air leak, somebody may have made adjustments to the carburetor to compensate for that leaky intake manifold, so sometimes they'll idle completely different with a brand new intake manifold. Hope you found that useful. See you on the next one. Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com.